We live in a time of much chaos, political friction, economic concerns, environmental issues, terrorism, a lot of anxiety out there. People are bombarded with images and information daily, assaulting our senses with such an overload. Texting, mobile phones, TV, iPads, video games, social media. We are connected, yet more disconnected. There is a kind of longing for something more, a desire even for art that makes us feel, to connect with something beyond ourselves. Is it possible to represent something beyond that which we can see with the naked eye, beyond the banal, cerebral world of much conceptual art and art that does not speak beyond the surface? Can artists whose focus is in the realm of representation express the nearly unpresentable in this current time in history and still be relevant? Well, may I suggest we consider an option, one that has been explored in the Romantic era, during the period of Modernism, by the abstract expressionists, and yes, even by purely conceptual artists. I'm suggesting that we consider the sublime as a current, accessible, and relevant mode of representational artistic expression. Why not the sublime? I'm not a philosopher nor aesthetic scholar. I am an artist, one who primarily works with low-tech materials to express my vision. I am not the consummate expert, but I am a practitioner of sorts. I hope by the end of this short time that we have together, we will have a little better grasp on what the sublime is, and some inspiration from artists who are currently exploring this realm and reimagining it. What is the sublime? After all, it's been debated by scholars for hundreds of years. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as you see on this slide. The word is used casually today as a kind of superlative. That meal was sublime, or what a sublime voice she has. For our purposes, it's something else. In the sphere of philosophy, music, and art, it is a spectrum of more specific meaning. Some even border on being contradictory. Some of you may have seen my door in the lobby, not a particularly strong painting. I brought it mainly to support my talk. It has its root in the Latin word sublimis, roughly beneath the lintel or up to the top of the door, elevated. Great philosophers and scholars in aesthetics refer to the sublime as a quality of greatness. It refers to a greatness beyond measure, transcendent and awe-inspiring. Nothing compares to it. It is ungraspable. Something that is sublime is capable of causing amazement, awe, and wonder. Many have written about it. In light of the brief time I have with you, I will touch on only a few of the key theories. The first known use of the term is attributed to Longinus in the 1st century CE in his Perihypsus, or On the Sublime. I will only touch upon him as his concern was upon great, elevated thought, lofty language, and rhetoric. For him, the word was used as an adjective. His concern was for great writing and how it could be achieved. Essentially, sublime writing should do more than persuade. They should overwhelm the audience, transport them, and delight them toward the conclusion of the writer. He wanted the writer to ask, how does my writing compare to Homer or to Plato? For our purposes, I will briefly touch upon a couple of philosophers whose theories affect us more in the visual arts. So, from this, it could be surmised that the sublime in visual art should transport the viewer. In his book, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Feelings of the Sublime and the Beautiful, Edmund Burke tried to find a physiological basis for the feeling evoked by the sublime. For example, eye tension caused by strain in response to darkness. A relief from pain he labeled delight, something moving away from pain to a neutral state. Pleasure is a movement away from a neutral state to pleasure. He argued that the beautiful and sublime were mutually exclusive. Considers beauty a simple positive pleasure, for example, balance or smoothness, delicacy, bright color. It attracts us and connects us to others. On the other hand, the sublime produces jaw-dropping expression caused by sudden relief from terror. He believes the basis of the sublime is our sense of our own mortality. Some of its causes are darkness, obscurity, vastness, associated more with terror than elation to Burke. It is the strongest emotion the mind is capable of feeling. Intense effects of the sublime are superior to the beautiful. According to Burke, the beautiful is of human scale. The sublime is immense. In contrast, in his works, Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime and The Critique of Judgment, philosopher Immanuel Kant said that, unlike Burke's assertions, the sublime does not apply to objects. It applies to nature. It does not apply to art because there is no intention when judging the object. It is our ideas of reason are what is sublime, not the object. He says our experience cannot be based entirely on our physical senses. We are spiritual beings. We have an awareness of time and space. We have an idea of infinity, not because of empirical evidence. It comes instead from our super-sensible powers of reason. We have a dimension which is transcendent. It transcends the world given by our senses. He said the mathematical sublime deals with vast formless objects, massive scale, overwhelms our mind's ability to comprehend, such as the cosmos. The dynamical sublime deals with the enormous, powerful forces of nature, like huge storms, earthquakes, etc. We are small and weak by comparison to these. He says there are two finer feelings. One, feelings of the beautiful, such as flowers, grazing flocks, sunsets, and two, the feelings of the sublime. These arouse enjoyment, but with horror. Terrifying, a certain dread of melancholy. Noble, this is like a quiet wonder. Splendid, pervaded with beauty. Simplistically, Kant differs from Burke. For Kant, sublime is transcendent, rational. The human mind, most awesome. For Burke, it involves the object, the lofty and the elevated. As artists, we argue and debate about our aesthetic judgment, especially with art. To Kant, there is no objective property of a thing that makes it beautiful. We must not point to the sublime in works of art, where a human determines the forms and magnitude. Instead, the sublime arises from the experience of raw nature. More on this later when we briefly look at this notion in modernism. I'd like to ask that you imagine you are standing on the edge of a great cliff, and a mile below you are jagged rocks and a treacherous river. And you have this sensation of falling. Now, let's look at some images regarding this. Here we see a young girl on a swing. A common image, except she is a couple miles up in the air. What feeling does this produce in you? May I suggest this as an example of an image with the capacity to provoke a feeling of the sublime. Let's go back in history, back to the 19th century, to the Romantic period. This period was roughly 1800 to 1850, and it originated in Europe. There were anxieties caused by rapid industrialization and the apparent withdrawal of God from human affairs. For the Romantics, the sublime was evoked by contemplating the spectacle of nature. Its awesome majesty and power raised the spirit beyond the common world. In this piece, artist John Martin shows the destruction of Babylon, the natural world. It depicts a cataclysm by volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, storms. This is inspired by biblical references in Revelation. Here the sublime points to our smallness in the wake of a power far greater than us. It points to the overwhelming power of the divine. The Romantics coupled the infinite universe with the majesty of the divine as an aesthetic response. The boundless universe came to represent the infinite power of God, a partial escape from the modern realities. The German idealists had a developing concern. How can the infinite, the absolute, be presented through sensory experience? One painter who represented this period of time was Caspar David Friedrich. Artists of this period used the power and grandeur of nature to express the sublime. To Friedrich, nature gave proof of the divine. In this piece, a man gazes upon the craggy landscape, shrouded in thick fog. The horizon melts into the sky. In the spirit of Kantian sublime, there is a self-reflection here. It stands as a metaphor for the mysteries of the future, the transitory nature of life, and the eternal specter of death. Another artist who was very familiar with Burke's theories was J.M.W. Turner. Turner embodied many of Burke's ideas in his work. According to Burke, anything capable of generating the passions of pain, danger, fear, sickness, horror, death is of the sublime. Being in actual danger was not necessary to produce the sublime. So, art could evoke the sublime in its viewers. If there is enough distance, the sublime can bring delight. So paintings, by their very nature, could do this. Great astonishment and fear completely fill the mind. Fear requires something Burke calls obscurity or darkness. Great size and vastness, like oceans and space, are more sublime than literal landscapes. They're more frightening. This is slaves throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on, or otherwise known as slave ship. Turner was a proponent of abolishing slavery. He knew it was common practice for sea captains to throw dead or dying slaves overboard while at sea, so they could claim insurance for the loss at sea. This is a sublime seascape on its own, but this invokes the human element, the humanistic side of the sublime. During this romantic period of the 18th century, the sublime was seen as a kind of effort to rejoin man and nature, to blend subject with the outside world. Turner could visualize the sublime. He caught it in many of his works. It is said that he made people feel with their eyes. Does it matter if the sublime is in the painting itself or in the viewer? The sense of ecstasy used to be the domain of the church. Well, Turner made it accessible to all. He secularized it. He painted big things, big mountains, wild oceans, references to old Greek or Roman biblical scenes. He made great use of the obscure, not detailed portraits or still lifes, extreme situations of nature. He did not paint in plein air because pre-made paint did not yet exist. He went out to experience the situation, subjects that raised fear, burning ships, shipwrecks, storms at sea, etc. In this piece we see a steamboat surrounded by a fierce vortex. It is said that Turner had himself lashed to the mast of a steamship at sea during 4 hours of a storm. Later, he then painted the experience back in the studio. Here we see the obscure vessel, darkness, a muted palette. The viewer is placed in the sea. It sort of represents mankind's futile efforts to combat the forces of nature. Turner often painted sea pieces, quite often merging the sky and the sea, making the two obscure. Here, they blend into a tempest of seawater and rain clouds. He often attempted to depict motion. His paintings were open. We can't tell where the sea stops and the sky begins. Notice the swooping, obscuring motion of muddy colors, the contrasting light, where the sea stops and the sky begins. Notice the swooping, obscuring motion. Turner's work tapped Burke's theories to create sublime paintings, obscure and frightening. This is an example of my meager attempt at emulating Turner, blurring the sense of reality just a little further. Here I used composition gold leaf, copper leaf, chemically induced patinas, and oil on panel. Same aspect ratio as Turner's DaLuz, just slightly larger. I used darkness, obscurity, the vaguest attempt at depicting sea as semi-vortex, some attempts at motion, all in an effort to engender the sublime with no literal point of reference. Now, Romanticism carried over from England to America with an emphasis on nature. A lack of people, low horizons, big skies, emphasis on light. The sublime became a key theme of the Hudson River School painters in America. Some were also Luminists around 1850 to 1875. Their work was usually much smaller than the Hudson River School. Peaceful, aerial perspective, almost monotone, but sublime nonetheless. Hills and mountains faded into hazy atmospheres. They captured the effects of sunlight and moonlight. They were concerned with the spiritual. This piece by Frederick Edwin Church, a student of Thomas Cole, depicts an absolutely massive vista. A volcano in Ecuador with its immense destructive power, yet a source of renewal at the same time. The sun peeks through smoke and clouds. Blue sky to the left gives a hint that all is under control. There's a certain sense of hopefulness. The calm lake, raging falls, craggy cliffs, an astonishing view of nature. Church traveled off the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland to study icebergs for several months in a wooden ship. The broken mast in this painting you see here was added later, honoring Sir John Franklin, who went down with his ships in the North Sea. It symbolizes the fragility of man against the forces of nature. He saw this as evidence of the power of God. Not long after completing this work, at age 51, rheumatism crippled his right hand. He tried to paint with his left, but failed. Looking down on Yosemite Valley, the title of this work by Albert Bierstadt, a highly detailed painting with romantic glowing light. Bierstadt was known for large mountainous landscapes depicting the unspoiled wildness of the American West. He was criticized by some for his overemphasis on light. Mount Bierstadt and Bierstadt Lake in Colorado are named in his honor. This piece inspired me to create a work derived from shapes within it. I call it Odyssey after Bierstadt. It's oil and metal leaf on panel, 4 feet square. Here I attempted to create a vast shape that partially feels like open space and partially resembles a massive ship of energy and light, a sort of conveyance to move one between dimensions to another realm. The great Russian romantic Ivan Aivazovsky clearly subscribed to attributes of the sublime in his work. He was considered one of the greatest marine painters in history. He was very prolific. He created over 6,000 paintings in 60 years. He and Turner met in Rome in 1842. Turner considered him a genius. Aivazovsky showed in Europe and the United States. In this piece, we see the force of nature as consuming. Light, however, is the eternal symbol of life, hope, and faith. Light as creator, if you will. By the mid-19th century, Russian realism was beginning to emerge, and he was criticized for his insistent romanticism. He did not care, however, kept painting what he loved. Here, the swirling vastness of nature against the comparative insignificant puniness of man produces this sense of the sublime. After about 1850, beauty became the most compelling aesthetic ideal. German realism began to emerge. The Pre-Raphaelites, who were more interested in truth to nature, accurate depictions of natural phenomena. They avoided tempests and such as mediums of sentiment. Many artists abandoned the pursuit of the sublime and became more interested in beauty and scientific realism. For some time, beauty supplanted romanticism through the latter part of the 19th century into the early 20th century. According to the philosopher, sociologist, literary theorist Jean-Francois Lyotard, the sublime was a founding theme of the modernist period. Beauty was replaced and human reason reigned supreme. Based on Kant, since the sublime is something we can have no image for, seemed to be a great fit for abstract painters. The aesthetic theories of Kant began to resurface, but were interpreted in a different way. Kant said, quote, "Every artist must produce something completely new instead of following a model from the past," unquote. Modernism embraced this. Instead of representing like Friedrich, Turner, and the Romantics, modernists use abstracted color, light, and space, infinite radiant voids to carry us beyond reason into the realm of the sublime. In 1948, Barnett Newman said, quote, "The impulse of modern art resides in the desire to destroy beauty. The problem with beauty is that it prevents the artist from realizing man's desire for the exalted, for the sublime," unquote. He felt figuration interfered with our ability to perceive the absolute. The unbound mind cannot be represented by an object. Here is his Vir Heroicus Sublimis, or Man Heroic Sublime. In this piece, man is present. Lyotard says Newman's sublime resides in the event of the picture. There is no hidden deity, no complex meaning. This is it. Color is the primary vehicle of expression. Color is freed from any objective context. It is the subject itself. There's great scale in the work. The zips, or the vertical lines you see, give contrast of scale against the color field. It is a painting as entity, no illusion. Another artist of this period who subscribed to this interpretation of Kant was Mark Rothko. This is Rothko Chapel in Houston. By the way, Mark Rothko was an admirer of Turner. According to Rothko, to paint a small picture, you place yourself outside of your experience. You paint large, and you are in it. Here he created a spiritual work for secular times. Size, space, light, thin layers of color seep through the darkness. They vibrate between figure and ground. We are now the man before the sea in Friedrich's painting. It takes us beyond reason into this realm of the sublime. Let's move the clock forward to the beginning of this century. While this may not be sublime itself, it references an event that aroused the sublime in 2001. This is an allegorical tribute to those events, one of the longest realist paintings in America. All of you probably remember exactly where you were and what you were doing when the Twin Towers collapsed before your eyes. We had the reality of watching the horror unfold before our eyes through the safe distance of our televisions. This was a recent event that conjured the sublime. We live in a digital world now. A technological sublime is surfacing, yet many in the world still long for that which is made by human hands, one of a kind. As representational artists, we are free to express with or without those technologies. A painting slows things down, both for the artist and the viewer. It freezes a moment for great contemplation and consideration. Let's look at a few figurative painters who are working today who raise the sublime with their work. Some do it in ways similar to 19th century romantics. Others approach it from a different perspective, reimagining what it can mean in the realm of representational art. This oil painting is by Biran Ortner, Element 3. It gives rise to the sublime. I show this to provide a sense of scale and to show the viewer experiencing the caress of the sea in this painting. In keeping with the romantic notions of the sublime, there is a sense of awe that's produced by such a work. These works can be as large as 8 feet by 32 feet. There is no sky, land, boats, figures, or points of reference of any kind. Only the sea. Notice the muted color. Ortner is a surfer. He spent many hours in the ocean, experiencing it firsthand, his body immersed in it, much like Turner lashed to the ship. The artist puts us in the sea. We are enveloped by it. It has devastating power, vastness, able to crush man's largest creations, yet the capacity to be gentle and caressing like a mother's womb. Some may disagree with the images I have chosen here to illustrate my point. I accept that, but for me, these images, while focusing upon the figure, place humanity squarely in the midst of an environment that fits aspects of the theories on the matter. I think they are exciting and fresh, particularly for representational artists. This work is by Australian artist Jeremy Geddes. It depicts a floating cosmonaut escorted by a flock of pigeons in some earthly realm. He performs a kind of floating dance through an ambiguous space. Is it post-apocalyptic? Does it speak to the fragility of the planet, of humankind? There is a sense of awe here. Fear? Not so much. Sublime? I think so. Another of his works depicting a figure hurtling through a window, an impossible instant, seemingly stopped while midair in a trajectory to where? Notice again the muted palette, the light. The sensation within the human form can be associated with the sublime. Like a molecule of humanity, a certain awe is evinced in this piece, a kind of body planet out of near identical subjects. Is there a force holding them together? Are they falling or floating in space? What is that space? Exquisite realistic attributes are employed here to express something that toys with the notion of the sublime in a different way than the Romantics did. Now, the cluster, stripped of external trappings, is hurtling through a huge man-made structure. the frailty of the comparatively small organic forms against the hard, huge angular structure. We would likely gasp if we witnessed this as it happened. Is it a force of nature? Does it matter? Here is another Australian painter, Joel Ray. It borders on the surreal, but is really an aesthetic of the sublime. According to writer Jane Dennison, here we see the vast, pulsating energy of nature, majestic and threatening. Nature is pure, timeless, and a force of destruction. And here, man sucked into the void of the unknown, frail and small against this power, like a star being sucked into a black hole in the cosmos. The sensation of breaking free of the mundane, unfettered from the stresses and trappings of the modern world. In elevation, we have the sense of floating, the dark, foreboding atmosphere, the risk of being consumed by a massive, powerful beast. And in Moment of Truth, what do you see in this? His humanity is dwarfed and insufficient to stop this onslaught. I was asked to show paintings to convey some ways I attempt to respond to these theories in my own work. I did a series of works called Watchers, which entertain the notion of angelic entities. I used the properties of underlying metal leaf to enhance the sense of light. As light passes through the glazes of oil, it bounces off the reflective surface, giving me a bit more light than I have been able to achieve with straight oil paint alone. In this painting, a life-sized figure descends directly above the viewer. What would you feel if this is what you saw as you were just opening your eyes? Would it be elation, peace, surprise, fear, perhaps? I suppose it depends upon the viewer's subjective experiences to that point and upon their culture. This one is Sentinel, an imagined entity, part of that same series. The face is obscured. There's no specific identity. It's occupying a space of the real and another realm simultaneously. I wanted to depict the figure as materializing from some kind of otherworldly energy. This piece is called Becoming, which is my effort to depict the feeling going on in the mind of the woman who is in a meditative state. Her corporeal body dissolving away, revealing pure energy and light that comprises the reality of her being. She begins to feel as if floating in a transcendent state of being. Yes, we can use real forms that we see in this world to convey this feeling, but we can push beyond that and tap the depths of our imagination as well. This is Sirens' Song, a place I conjured from the imagination. There is a distant vastness, yet a stillness, one where your whispers could echo off the canyon walls. The darkness obscures, the light obscures. It's not a real place, but it could be. Only the viewer occupies this world. And in this piece, which I've titled Vortex, there's a swirling mass of energy, a kind of subterranean glimpse barely revealed through the dark abyss. There's a strong contrast of light. The viewer wonders, what is it I'm looking at exactly? And in this work, which I've titled Window, there's an attempt to reveal a rift in the atmosphere, a tear through earthly space, revealing or perhaps obscuring something just beyond. There's darkness, extreme contrasting light, vague detail. One evening, while watching a science program on TV, I was in one of those states of being half awake and half asleep. As I was listening to the program, I imagined myself hurtling at the speed of light through space. And as I was traveling in this way in my blue jeans and t-shirt, I began to wonder what would happen if I reached the end of a universe, or what if there was no end. And as soon as I had this thought, I found myself rupturing some membrane. And as I did this, I began to slow down, and my body slowly turned, floating in space. And as I turned, I saw something that looked like a massive human-like egg that was opening. And there was a lot of light and gas clouds and such that were being revealed, I realized I was looking at the whole universe contained within another universe. About that moment, I awoke and, with excitement, declared to myself that I must paint this. Well, this is the result of that. This is Ovum 2, which was spawned as a result of that dream. My feeble attempt to present the entire universe as a massive ovary opening to reveal that gaseous light and energy of trillions of galaxies and stars. As the viewer, I imagined it as contained within another universe. Well, some of you may say, that isn't representational. It isn't real. It's abstract. If you look upon this image and consider it was made with paint, you might consider it an abstraction. In reality, it is an actual photo of Carina Nebula in our own galaxy. One might consider it abstract, yet it is objective reality. According to the theoretical physicist David Bohm, quote, "Reality is no thing, also not the totality of all things," unquote. This to me is liberating. In 2004, the Hubble telescope pointed to a tiny point in space. It was completely devoid of light and the size of a grain of sand when held at arm's length. They opened the shutter for 11 days. This was the picture that came back. It is known as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Here we are looking at over 10,000 galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars. It took 13 billion years for the photons from these galaxies to hit the Hubble sensors, because many of them are moving away from us at nearly the speed of light. It is about 47 billion light years away. Why am I showing you this? When we consider the massiveness of the cosmos, we can't even begin to put this in any meaningful perspective. It is sublime, not because it concerns the real, but because it reveals the limitations of our attempts to put our minds around it. How a person feels about a work is influenced by experience and culture. Something I might feel is sublime may not resonate in the same way with another. Herein lies the challenge for representational artists. As Kant said, we are a finite humanity cast into an infinite world. The aesthetic idea is a presentation of the imagination to which no thought is adequate, unquote. There is an incredible and fascinating range of thinking on the sublime. It is a kind of doorway. This Hubble image reminds us of our ability to imagine. It shows us a reality that exists beyond our capacity to see with our naked eyes, and should serve as a call to us as artists that the possibilities for us are truly boundless.